Hello. Today we're going to continue our study in Joshua. We're going to be in Joshua chapter 7 and 8 that talks about a rather unusual thing that happened after Jericho. But I think it really teaches a religious truth, and I think it's going to be very helpful for us today. Let's get our Bibles and turn to Joshua chapter 7. But the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to the things under the ban. Now, this unfaithfully is a word that means to act under cover. It means to break trust in the sense of doing something purposefully. Now, notice it says under the ban. Now, this is the word for harem. We get the word harem from it. It's the idea of something dedicated to God that becomes so holy that human beings can't use it. It is connected with the concept of holy war that's very difficult for us in the modern world to understand. But it was a very common thing in the ancient world. We're going to see what has happened here in connection with one man's sin affecting the entire community. One man's judgment is going to affect his entire family. It's something that a modern American needs to think about because we have overemphasized individualism, and this is a proper balance. It's a balance that can be seen when one compares Deuteronomy 5:9 with Deuteronomy 24:16. Both the aspect of corporality and the aspect of individualness are biblical truths, and they must be held in a kind of tension. Now, for Achan, and then it mentions several different of his family here. It mentions so many of them because the author really wants you to know who this is. One of the tribes of Judah took some things under the ban. Therefore, the anger of the Lord burned against the sons of Israel. Now, folks, I want to tell you that the same Bible that tells us that God is love, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, is the same Bible that tells us that God's love spurned results in God's anger. And the anger of God is as biblical as the love of God. They are both anthropomorphic emotions, meaning they're human emotions that we project on God, but they both reveal a truth about our Heavenly Father. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai. The word Ai means the heap. We think it refers to ruins. Matter of fact, the archaeology of the day says that Ai was not settled during Jeremiah's time, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel. Now, Beth-aven, Beth in Hebrew means house, Bethel, house of God, Beth-aven, house of vanity or nothingness, and therefore used in the sense of idolatry. Now, Beth-aven is used for Bethel several different times in the Bible. Now, the reason I'm going through all this is because we know that the king of Bethel was defeated, but the destruction of Bethel is never mentioned. Many of us believe that possibly Bethel and Ai are somehow connected. One may be a military camp, an outpost, somehow the populations intermerged, and what we have in the defeat of Ai is possibly the defeat of Bethel. But I want to show it to you step by step so you can see. There are places where in certain books of the Bible, Bethel is called Beth-aven. You might want to see 1 Samuel 13:5, the book of Hosea, chapter 4, verse 15, chapter 5, verse 8, chapter 10, verse 5, and the book of Amos, chapter 5, verse 5. Archaeology would say to us that there are no ruins of Ai during the period of Joshua's conquest. Now, let me just say right quick, archaeology is very tentative at this point. We're not sure we have the right site of Ai, and so we can't draw any conclusive conditions there. But in the Bible, these two sites of Bethel and Beth-aven are quite often linked. You might want to see chapter 8, verse 9, and verse 17. So I'm not sure exactly what it is. It may be the little town of Ai, and it may refer to the destruction of Bethel too. In a little later on in this discussion, we're going to see there seem to be two ambush units sent. One sent the night before, and one sent the same day. Now, modern critical scholarship has said, it's two accounts that have been blended together. But could it be possible there were two ambushes set up, one at Bethel and one at Ai, and both were taken at the same time? I'm not sure. It's very difficult to have a definitive answer on this one. They went up to spy out the land. The men went and looked. They returned to Joshua and said, "Do not let all the people go up. Only about 2,000 or 3,000 men need to go up to Ai. Do not make all the people toil up there, for they are few." Now, what do you mean toil up there? Well, Ai is up on a high part of land. Matter of fact, the land rises from the Jordan Valley, where they are, probably at Gilgal, 3,400 feet in 16 miles. Now, that's a pretty good trek uphill. We know from chapter 8, verse 35, that there are only 12,000 people in this city. Maybe the Israelis had got overconfident with what happened at Jericho. The spies said send 2 or 3. Joshua sent about 3,000, but that was only a small part of the major force that he had. So he's going to send them. The Lord didn't tell him to go, but we assume Joshua was fulfilling the plan of God. Ai was the next logical target, especially on the way to Shechem, which we'll see at the end of chapter 8. So about 3,000 men went up there, and they fled from the men of Ai. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means they turned their back or turned their neck. And it was an embarrassing thing. Matter of fact, if you look at the next verse, and the men of Ai struck down about 36 of their men and pursued them from the gate as far as, now there's a Hebrew word here in verse 5. The Hebrew term means a stone quarry. The Septuagint translates this as to the brink, some kind of drop-off place. And the Vulgate makes this a proper name, like my New American Standard. We're not exactly sure where this geographical location is, but it's obvious these men of Ai, these few men, chased these other men a long way and killed 36 of them. You mean 36 men died because of one man's sin? Yes. Because God is presenting a very spiritual truth. They are not taking the land of Canaan because of their military expertise. They are taking the land of Canaan because God has given it to them and God is with them. But there is a conditional moral covenant requirement. And that's what we're going to see. Now, notice what happened. Struck them down to the descent, so the hearts of the people melted and became as water. That's exactly the same term used for the Canaanite peoples. Chapter 2, verse 11, chapter 5, verse 1. You see, what they had experienced with God on another group side is what now Israel was experiencing. They recognized their own powerlessness. It's almost like the 2 New Testament verses where Jesus says, without me you can't do anything. But the balance is, with me, we can do all things. And we've got to see that. They both fit together. They've got to learn that truth. Now, notice here, let's see. Okay. By the way, their hearts melting does show some lack of faith on their part because they don't know what the problem is yet. So Joshua tore his clothes. Now, in verse 6, we have 2 signs of mourning. The torn clothes, he fell to the earth, more a sign of reverence than just mourning. They're going to put dust on their heads. These are signs of mourning. We see some of them in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 12, 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 2, often used for the dead. And, of course, there were 36 dead soldiers. Notice it's going to be Joshua fell before the ark. That shows us, number one, the ark did not always go into battle with them. The ark was the symbolic presence of the Lord in the promised land. And Joshua said, listen to this now, alas, O Yahweh Elohim, why didst thou ever bring this people over Jordan, only to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been willing to dwell beyond the Jordan. Oh my, Joshua's warts are showing. A little unbelief is sneaking in here. He sounds a lot like unfaithfulness here. Oh God, we should have done that. We should have done this. And look down here in verse 9. They will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. Oh, really? I thought God made a promise. Joshua shows that he is not the complete man of faith. And by the way, none of us are we? We're a strange mixture of doubt and faith always. So is Joshua. There are no super saints, folks, just men with feet of clay. But God knows we're but dust. He'll use us if we trust him. A little unbelief here, a little doubt, a little fear of the Canaanites. And look at the end of verse 9. What wilt thou do for thy great name? Now, that's kind of the way that Moses used to argue with God. God, don't do this because your name will be reproached. And there's truth in that. God's name, God's character was involved in the success or failure of Israel, his unique people. I think there's some good places you ought to look at this. You might want to look at Joshua chapter 5, verse 9 that we're looking at here. You might look at Exodus 32:12, and you might want to confer at Deuteronomy 9:28. God did act for Israel so his name would be revealed to the earth, all the nations of the earth, through them. Unfortunately, for much of their history, it was God's acts of judgment, not God's acts of blessing that he wanted to do. Notice then where it says, so the Lord said to Joshua, rise up. Why is this that you have fallen on your face? I get so tickled here. It reminds me back of what Moses did earlier. Remember when Moses in Exodus 14, 15, and 16, when the army of Pharaoh came after them and Moses fell on his face, began to pray, "Oh God, why have you brought us out here to die?" And God kind of says, "Moses, get up and hold that staff over the waters." There's a time to pray and a time to get on with it. And what God's saying to Joshua is, what is a leader like you doing at a place like that? Get up, there's a problem here, take care of it. Ain't time to pray, time to do something. Israel has sinned. There's the problem. They have transgressed. Joshua thought it was God's problem. No, it's man's problem. And it always is, friend. It's not God's problem, not God's reluctance. It's our problem. We've sinned. Here it is said again. They have transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. They have even taken some of the things under the ban. They have stolen and deceived. Moreover, they have put them among their own things. Now, he's only talking about one man. You mean one man affected the whole community? Yeah. That's what happened to Baal of Peor earlier, remember? A few committed adultery and the whole tribe was cursed with a plague. You mean Joshua's sins are going to affect all of them? Yes. And later on in chapter 22, they're afraid of the same thing, that the eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, have become idolatrous, and God's going to judge all the tribes for it. Friend, may I submit to you that we will not only stand before God for the individual responsibility of our lives and our families, but we're going to stand before God for our society. Because many times we've remained silent when we should have spoken. Now, let me go a little further in. Therefore the sons of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies, for they have become accursed. Notice that God's people become accursed when they break the covenant. I will not be with you anymore unless. Notice the covenant has conditions. God always comes first to man, but God has always said there's some conditions on my presence. There's some conditions. We get in the New Testament, maybe repent and believe, but it's still conditions. Walk ye in him, right? There's still conditions, always conditions. Rise up, consecrate the people, and say, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. For the Lord your God of Israel has said, these things are under the ban in your midst, O Israel. One of them had violated the covenant. It affected all of them. And how do you handle it? There must be a judgment on that sin. Now watch what happens. In the morning you shall come near by the tribes. It shall be the tribe which is taken. Now my translation, verse 14, says by lot, but it's in parenthesis. That means they're assuming that's the way God's going to do it. This is an assumption that we're speaking of the Urim and the Thummim of Numbers 27:21. You may look at some other places. 1 Samuel 10:20 mentions that. That's one of the ways they knew the will of God. And notice what's going to happen. It shall be that the one who has taken with the things under the ban shall be burned with fire, and he that all that belongs to him. Oh my. Look at verse 24. Achan became holy because he stole the holy things. Too holy to live. You might want to see Exodus 19:12 and 13. And then they do that. You have that recorded here. They went by, and then they finally found Achan, and Joshua said, my son, I implore you, give glory to the Yahweh, the God of Israel. Give praise to him. Now what Joshua was doing is kind of acting like a comforter, saying, Achan, this is not going to affect your eternity, but tell the truth, Achan. Now, all this time, Achan hadn't said a word. Achan could have confessed earlier. Achan didn't say a thing till the finger got put on him by the lot. And then he's going to confess. Now, so Achan answered Joshua, and here we have it down here. Look in verse 21. When I saw the spoil, a beautiful mantle from Shinar, it means kind of an outer robe from Babylon, 200 shekels of silver, a bar of gold, 50 shekels in weight, I coveted them. Oh, God help us. Now we'll see Colossians 3:5. It's the last commandment, isn't it? Thou shalt not covet. I took them, behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent with the silver beneath it. Beautiful robe, lots of pretty colors, pretty patterns, money. Pulled this man's heart away from the Lord. God help us, how often that happens. So Joshua sent messengers. They found it. It was concealed in the tent, just as he said. He took them outside the tent, brought them to Joshua, all the sons of Israel, and they poured them out before the Lord. That's a funny word, they poured them out, but I think it's just a metaphor for they laid all these things under the band so everybody could see them. Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, all the gold and all the things, all his cattle, all his children, his wife, his tent, all that belonged to him, and they brought him to the valley of Angkor, which means the place of troubling. And Joshua said, why have you troubled us? The Lord will bring trouble on you this day. Now the rabbi said that because it says this day, that means that Achan is safe with God in eternity, but will be judged this day. I'm not sure the rabbis can back it up from this verse, but I want to believe that. And all Israel stoned them. They killed them with stones. The family, Achan, his wife, his kids, they may have known about it. They may have seen the daddy hide it in there. May have been a culprit. But all his cattle, all his things are going to be burned. Why? Because there's a collective guilt there. Now, the first stoning in verse 25 is one Hebrew word that means to kill with stones, like capital punishment, which is this. But toward the end of verse 25 is another Hebrew word for stones, which means they stoned him to death, and then they're going to burn him and all his things with fire, and then they're going to raise a stone heap over them as a memorial, as a judgment memorial. And that's what the second word for stoning means here. So it's not stoned twice. It's two different words and two different cultural aspects of stoning. One is to kill him, then you burn him, then you put a pile of stones over where they were burned. And they raised over him a heap of great stones. That's verse 26. And the valley of Angkor is the place of troubling. You see it there in the bottom of verse 26. Now chapter 8. The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear. Well, he was afraid. He had been defeated in battle, his first time out of the chute, and he got bucked off. Do not be dismayed. Take all the people of war. Well, that's kind of hard because we know he's not going to take all. He's going to take about 30,000. There's a whole lot more than that. Well, sometimes the word all, the men of war, can mean less than all. You say, how can that be? Well, I don't know, but if you compare Joshua 1, 14 and 15 with Joshua 3, 12 through and 13, you'll see that all the eastern tribes' men of war didn't go, though it says they were all supposed to go. And if you compare verse 8:16 with 8:19, you see the word all doesn't have to mean all. I know that sounds funny, but we have the same problem in the New Testament about all Israel will be saved in Romans 11. And there are many places in the New Testament the word all doesn't mean all. It's one of those idiosyncrasies of language. Now they're going to set an ambush behind the city, and they're going to send these men out early apparently. Look at verse 3, 30,000 men early. Now the problem is there seems to be two accounts here. When you compare verse 3 with verse 12, it doesn't seem to fit real good. And a lot of people have made a lot to do about this, that there's two different accounts put together. And I must admit, I don't know how to reconcile this. I think maybe there's Bethel and Ai are both going to be attacked at the same time. Some say it's two different ambush groups. I don't know. Until I know more, I'm going to hold to the historicity and wait for further information. Now notice that God set this strategy. This is not Joshua's mind. God says set the ambush. Now, why didn't he just knock the walls down? Well, God didn't do it the same every time. He's wanting these men to act by faith. He's trying to build their faith. They've just been, their hearts have just melted. They've just said some very covenant and embarrassing things about, oh God, why did you bring us over here and all that. God's going to try to encourage them by giving them a battle plan. Show them little by little He's with them. I think that's what's going to happen here. Now, let's see. You can read through this. It's not a whole lot here as far as just how they did it. And notice verse 9, but Joshua spent the night among the people. Why? Well, he's trying to encourage them. His presence physically with them. He rose early in the morning, mustered the people. He went up with the elders of Israel before the people of Ai. And all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near and arrived in the front of the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now there was a valley between him and Ai. Notice the topological eyewitness details. Folks, this is from an eyewitness there, not written hundreds of years later. Somebody who was there, knew what was happening. Now, so he took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai. Here the cities are linked again. See, maybe they're somehow connected on the west side of the city. And so they stationed the people, all the army that was on the north side of the city, and its rear guard on the west side of the city. And Joshua spent the night in the midst of the valley. Again, he's with the people. Apparently they came in the daytime and brought all the attention of Ai on this side of the wall. And then during the night they moved down the valley and up to prepare for battle. And it came about when the king of Ai saw it. Remember, it's like a Greek city-state, a king of this local area. They hurried and rose up, went out to meet. Now, there's 12,000 inhabitants, so however many Joshua had, they thought they could beat them. They beat them once already. They thought, we can handle these guys. And so they came out, and Joshua played like he was running away. And all the people apparently in the city, now it's going to say all the people in the city left, but if you read it on further down, verse 19, they're going to come in and kill some of the men. So it all doesn't mean all again. And notice here, it's interesting, I think, when it says, and And then the Lord said to Joshua, verse 18, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai. Now here again is one of those things very much like Moses. Moses' staff was a symbol of God's presence. For Joshua, it seems to be the javelin. Joshua did not get Moses' staff. It's a new symbol, but it's still something in his hand that represents the power of God. He's going to hold it out to show it's not their military strategy, it's not their military might, it's the presence of God. And notice he's going to use some rather military strategy ways, not just knock the walls down again. I think when we tell God how he has to do something, I think he giggles and does it different 4 times, you know. And so the men ambush rose quickly. They got in the city. There was very few defenders there. They killed everybody in the city and set the thing on fire. Why? Well, it's holy war, folks. It's hard for us to understand. Everything that breathes has to die. But now Ai is different than Jericho. Jericho, everything belonged to God. But in Ai, just the people die because they're Canaanites. They're idolaters. But the cattle and the sheep and the spoils and all go to the warriors. So it's a little different here. It's not exactly the way it was. Now, they set it on fire. The men turned around and saw it. They had no place to flee. So they were killed in between the two armies here. Now let's continue then in verse 22. They slew them until no one was left of those who survived or escaped. And again, it's the holy war concept. You might want to read the relevant passage in Leviticus again. Now it came about when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness where they pursued them, and all of them were fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed. Then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. They came and killed all the people in the city too. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. The word utterly destroyed in verse 26 is the same concept of the harem again. Verse 27. Joshua took on the cattle and the spoil of the city as a plunder for themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which the Lord had commanded him. Now that's back in chapter 8, verse 2, where that's mentioned. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. That's very important. I think the king of Ai was already dead. They killed him with a sword. But why hang him? It was a sign of ultimate shame. You ought to see Deuteronomy 21:23, where someone hanged is cursed by God. They were showing this city was under the curse of God. It goes back to Genesis 15:16. The Amorite and the Canaanite were judged by God because of their idolatry. When the Jews take up the same practices, they are also going to be judged and taken into exile by cruel military means, and many of them will be killed. So God is no respecter of persons there. They took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the city. Now the Septuagint has in a pit, but the city maybe is good, and raised over it a great heap of stones. The same kind of burial procedure as Achan, a sign of a memorial of judgment, if you please. And it stands to this day. This shows this was. A later person wrote this down. The memorial stood sometime later. How long later? Much debate. A few years, many years, we're just not sure. It just says unto this day. But obviously an eyewitness account of the events. Now beginning in verse 30 through 35 is a whole new section, but a very important one. And I think very important to understand the whole Old Testament. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 27 and 28, Moses has told them that when they get into the Promised Land, to go to the city of Shechem, which, by the way, its destruction is never mentioned either, it's assumed. And on each side of the city were 2 mountains, Mount Gezerim and Mount Ebal. And they were divided, the Levitical singers on each side, and they were to sing the blessings of the covenant and the cursings for disobedience. And much of the rest of the Old Testament can be understood by these cursing and blessing section of Deuteronomy 27 and 28. And here we have them doing that in verse 30 through 35. Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal. Again, you might want to see Deuteronomy 27:4 particularly. Just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded him. The sons of Israel is written in the book of the law. Notice, written in the book of the law. I believe that Joshua had a written copy of the Pentateuch. An altar of uncut stones. And that shows man's wasn't needed. It was all of God, kind of like later on Elijah. Uncut stones symbolize the altar of Yahweh as opposed to the altar of Baal and Astarte, the fertility worship of Canaan, on which no man had wielded an iron tool. And they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. I think that's very important. And he wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. The Jews say that the 70 nations, all the Gentile nations, came and made copies of the law on these stones, and that's how they knew about God. Notice again, it was for memorials. They'd remember that they were under covenant obligations. And all Israel with their elders and officers and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priest who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And the stranger as well as the native, that's that mixed group that came out of Egypt, I guess, and some of them were still with the Israeli tribes. You might want to see again Deuteronomy 27, 12, and 13. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, half of them stood in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, given command at first to bless the people of Israel. Then afterwards to read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that's written in the book of the law. There is not a word of all that Moses had commanded with Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. Here is a solemn oath, is a recommitment to the covenant, really, is what it is. They knew what God said do, and they said, we'll do it. And all their families said, we'll do it. And now they're committed to follow the law of Moses. I think we have some tremendous things here. I hope you'll understand that the Old Testament is a miserable failure of man's attempt to keep the law of God. That's why I'm so glad I live in the New Covenant. It's a miserable failure. And Galatians 3 says to show us our needy, to bring us to Christ. All men are sinful. The Old Testament certainly proves that. Even in the presence of the covenant, even with the presence of God himself there, even with the presence of prophets, even with leaders like Joshua and Moses, they still sinned over and over. I hope you know that we will give an account to God for our sins. I don't think we're going to be judged for our sins. I think Jesus Christ's blood cleanses from all sins, but we're going to give an account of our life some way before God. And my friends, we're going to give account of our society and our community some way before God. And we need to balance the idea of corporality. In Adam, the whole world sinned. In Achan, the whole nation sinned. God help us. I look at my society and I'm afraid for us. I'm afraid for us. Think about what I've said. I've enjoyed being with you. God bless you. Have a good day.